She works for me. Reed Stone's fist slammed onto the lacquered table hard enough to silence every dangerous man in the room. His eyes locked on the street below where Sawyer Lee, his quiet, invisible maid, was laughing at something Flynn James whispered in her ear. The Mafia Boss, who never showed emotion, was about to shatter every protocol he'd built, because seeing his housekeeper dressed in a cocktail dress, glowing with freedom he didn't control, triggered something primitive and consuming. What started as a business meeting ended with Reed Stone hunting through the streets to destroy a date, proving that sometimes the most dangerous men lose their minds over the simplest things. A woman who dared to have a life outside his territory. The private room was designed for men who controlled territories, not emotions. Dark wood paneling absorbed sound, crystal tumblers caught amber light, and the conversation flowed with the careful precision of people who understood that words had consequences beyond social comfort. Reed Stone sat at the head of the table, his presence filling the space without effort, broad shoulders in a tailored charcoal suit, tattooed hands resting on mahogany, slate-gray eyes that tracked every micro-expression around him with predatory awareness. He was there to discuss expansion into the waterfront properties, a conversation that required focus and strategic calculation. What he didn't expect was to have his entire world detonated by a glimpse through a window. 10 minutes into the territorial negotiation, Reed's attention caught on movement outside, just a flicker of black fabric and confident stride that shouldn't have registered as significant. But something in the gait, the particular way the woman moved, pulled his focus away from millions of dollars in real estate and locked it on the street 3 stories below. He went absolutely still. Sawyer Lee, his maid, his quiet, nearly invisible housekeeper who moved through his penthouse like a ghost, who spoke only when necessary, who kept her eyes down and her presence minimal, except this woman on the street wasn't invisible. She was wearing a sleek black cocktail dress that hit just above her knees, her usually practical hair loose and catching the streetlight, her entire bearing transformed from subservient caution to easy confidence. And she wasn't alone. But there was one thing he didn't know about his closest ally. Reed's jaw tightened as a man appeared beside Sawyer, clean-cut, probably mid-30s, wearing business casual that screamed safe career and stable income. The man said something that made Sawyer laugh, a real, unguarded laugh that Reed had never heard in the 8 months she'd worked for him. She touched the man's arm naturally, familiarly, the gesture of someone comfortable with physical affection. Reed's hands curled into fists on the table. "Mr. Stone?" One of his associates ventured carefully. "About the waterfront terms. She works for me." The words came out low, lethal, vibrating with something that had nothing to do with professional authority and everything to do with primitive possession. In that moment, the entire balance of power flipped. The room went silent. 5 dangerous men stared at their boss, trying to understand why a territorial negotiation had just been derailed by a statement about household staff. Reed didn't care about their confusion. His entire focus was locked on the street below, where Flynn James, he'd know the man's name within the hour, was now placing his hand on the small of Sawyer's back, guiding her toward what looked like an upscale restaurant 2 blocks east. The sight of another man touching her, guiding her, making her laugh like that, sent a wave of blinding jealousy through Reed that he had no framework to process. Sawyer Lee was his routine, his peace after brutal days managing operations, his one predictable element in a world of constant threats and calculations. She arrived at 7 a.m., cleaned with meticulous efficiency, prepared meals exactly as he preferred, and disappeared by 6 p.m. into whatever life she maintained outside his territory. If you've ever felt invisible, been told you take up too much space, or had someone make you feel like you're too much or not enough, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button right now and comment where you're watching from. We're building a family of people who refuse to shrink anymore. Except now he was seeing that life, and it was beautiful, and free, and completely beyond his control. Reed stood abruptly, his chair scraping back with enough force that it nearly toppled. "Meeting's over. Marcus, find out everything about the man with her name, employment, address, criminal history, financial records. I want it in 30 minutes. Marcus, his head of security, blinked. "Boss, we're mid-negotiation. I don't care." Reed's voice dropped to something dangerous. "She works for me, and I need to know who thinks he can take what's mine." He had no idea the night would end in blood. He was already moving toward the door, his expensive suit jacket left draped over the chair, his focus narrowed to singular purpose. Reaching that restaurant before Sawyer sat down to dinner with a man who represented everything. Reed couldn't offer normalcy, safety, a life without constant danger. His associates exchanged glances that mixed confusion with carefully hidden amusement. Their boss, The man who'd built an empire on calculated control and emotional detachment had just lost his mind over a maid having a date. But none of them were stupid enough to comment on it while Reed Stone was in earshot. Reed took the stairs instead of the elevator, 3 flights, at a pace that would have winded normal men but barely elevated his breathing. His mind was racing faster than his feet, constructing and discarding scenarios. Was this Flynn James a rival trying to infiltrate his household through Sawyer? Was she being coerced or threatened? Or, and this possibility made his chest tighten with something close to panic, was she simply choosing someone else? Choosing a normal life over the one that revolved around Reed's schedule and needs? Someone in the room was lying, but who? He burst through the building's street entrance with enough force that the doorman startled backward. The restaurant was 2 blocks east, an upscale Italian place Reed had used for meetings that required the illusion of casualness. He knew the owner, which meant he could walk in without reservation and demand whatever table he wanted. What he wanted was a clear view of Sawyer Lee and the man who dared touch her like he had rights to her attention. The evening air was cold enough to see his breath, but Reed barely registered temperature as he covered the 2 blocks with ground-eating strides that made pedestrians step aside instinctively. Dangerous men carried a particular energy that civilians recognized on some primal level, the sense that violence was an available option rather than a distant threat. He reached the restaurant in under 3 minutes. His heart rate elevated not from exertion but from the toxic combination of jealousy and possessive fury that was currently rewiring his brain chemistry. Through the large front windows, he could see them, Sawyer and Flynn James, seated at a corner table with wine already poured, engaged in conversation that looked easy and comfortable. Sawyer was smiling, not the careful, professional expression she maintained in his penthouse, but a genuine, relaxed smile that transformed her entire face. She looked younger, happier, like the 8 months of working in his controlled environment had been carefully suppressing this version of her. Her next words hit him harder than any bullet. Reed's hands clenched at his sides. He'd seen Sawyer nearly every day for 8 months, moving efficiently through his space, maintaining boundaries so rigid he barely thought of her as a person beyond her function. But now, watching her through restaurant glass, he was seeing what he'd refused to acknowledge. She was beautiful. Not in the ostentatious way of the women who orbited his world seeking proximity to power, but in something quieter and more devastating. Genuine, unguarded, real, and she was giving all that authenticity to someone else. Reed pushed through the restaurant entrance with controlled force, the kind of entry that announced authority without needing verbal declaration. The host looked up, recognition flashing across his face before settling into professional deference. "Mr. Stone, we weren't expecting. Table for 1. Reed's eyes never left Sawyer's position across the dining room, somewhere with a clear view of that corner. What he discovered next changed everything. The host followed Reed's gaze and made the calculation that every service worker in Reed's territory learned quickly. Don't ask questions. Don't offer commentary. Just accommodate the request and hope you don't get caught in whatever was about to unfold. "Of course, sir. Right this way." Reed was seated 4 tables away from Sawyer, close enough to hear fragments of conversation when the ambient noise dipped, far enough that he wasn't obviously hovering. He ordered whiskey he wouldn't drink and declined the menu he wouldn't read. His entire focus was on Sawyer Lee and the man who was currently making her laugh again. Flynn James was exactly the kind of man Reed had expected and hated on sight. Conventionally attractive in an unthreatening way, dressed in business casual that suggested steady employment without criminal complications, body language open and warm in the way of people who'd never needed to calculate danger before speaking. He was ordinary, safe, the kind of man who probably had a 401k and took women to restaurants with Yelp reviews instead of requiring bodyguards at dinner. The kind of man Sawyer could build a normal life with. He realized he wasn't alone, someone else had arrived. Reed's jaw clenched hard enough that he felt the muscle jump. He watched Flynn reach across the table and touch Sawyer's hand, not possessively, but gently. The gesture of someone who asked permission through incremental approach rather than claiming through assumption of rights. Sawyer didn't pull away. In fact, she turned her hand over, letting their palms connect briefly before withdrawing with a small smile. Something dark and consuming exploded in Reed's chest. He'd never thought about Sawyer's personal life before this moment, had actively avoided acknowledging that she existed beyond the hours she spent in his space. But now, watching her with someone else, he was being forced to confront what he'd been deliberately ignoring. He didn't want her to have a personal life. He wanted her to exist only in relation to him, only within his territory, only under his control. The realization should have been horrifying. Instead, it felt inevitable. "Boss!" Marcus appeared at Reed's elbow, moving with the practiced stealth of someone who'd learned not to startle armed men. "You wanted information on Flynn James." Reed didn't look away from Sawyer's table. Tell me. High school math teacher at Eastbridge Academy. Clean record. No criminal history. No debt. No red flags. Parents are retired in Vermont. One sister in medical school. Owns a modest condo in a safe neighborhood. By all accounts, he's exactly what he appears to be, a normal, decent guy who probably met Sawyer through some kind of community thing. Something didn't add up, and the truth was darker than he expected. Every word was a knife. Reed didn't want Flynn to be dangerous, because that would have justified intervention on security grounds. But a normal, decent, high school teacher? That was an enemy Reed couldn't eliminate through traditional means without revealing the depth of his irrational obsession with his own household staff. How long have they been seeing each other? Reed's voice was carefully neutral, but Marcus knew him well enough to hear the violence underneath. Unknown. This might be a first date, or they might have been keeping it quiet. Sawyer's pretty careful about her private life, no social media presence, doesn't talk about personal matters with other staff. Marcus paused. Boss, I have to ask, what's the operational concern here? Because if this is personal, it's not personal. Reed's lie was transparent enough that Marcus wisely didn't challenge it. Sawyer has access to my private residence. Anyone she associates with represents a potential security vulnerability. I'm simply being thorough. Marcus made a non-committal sound that suggested he wasn't buying the professional justification but wasn't stupid enough to argue. Want me to continue monitoring? No. Reed stood abruptly, his decision made. I'll handle this directly. His next decision would decide whether he lived or died. He was moving toward Sawyer's table before Marcus could respond, before his rational brain could provide reasons why confronting his maid during her personal time was catastrophically inappropriate. But Reed Stone had built an empire on trusting his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was screaming that he needed to end this, needed to establish dominance, needed to make absolutely clear that Sawyer Lee belonged in his world, not Flynn James's. Sawyer was mid-sentence when she sensed someone approaching. She looked up, and the color drained from her face when she registered who was standing beside her table. Mr. Stone. Her voice was carefully professional, but Reed caught the tremor underneath. I wasn't expecting this. Is a surprise? Reed's tone was pleasant, conversational, and absolutely terrifying to anyone who understood him. Yes, I imagine it is. Funny coincidence, finding you here, at one of my restaurants, on what appears to be a date. From here on, the rules of the game changed. Flynn James, oblivious to the danger, stood and extended his hand with the friendly confidence of someone who'd never needed to calculate power dynamics before speaking. You must be Sawyer's employer. She's mentioned you're busy. Reed didn't take the offered hand. I'm very busy, which makes it particularly interesting that my housekeeper has time for extended dinners during hours she should be available for household emergencies. Sawyer stood now, her expression shifting from shock to carefully controlled anger. I'm off duty, Mr. Stone. My contract specifies. Your contract. Reed's smile was sharp enough to cut. Yes. Let's discuss your contract. Specifically, the clause about maintaining appropriate boundaries and avoiding conflicts of interest. Does Flynn here know where you work? Does he understand the security implications of dating someone with access to my private residence? That's completely inappropriate, Sawyer began. But Reed wasn't finished. What's inappropriate is conducting personal relationships without proper vetting and clearance. What's inappropriate is prioritizing your social life over your professional responsibilities. What's inappropriate, Reed's voice dropped lower, dangerous, is making me find out about significant life developments through accident rather than disclosure. And then, the gun clicked. The restaurant had gone quiet around them. Other diners sensing the tension and either watching overtly or pretending not to notice while listening intently. Flynn James looked between Reed and Sawyer with growing alarm, finally registering that this wasn't a normal employer-employee interaction. Look, Mr. Stone, Flynn said carefully. I don't think Sawyer needs permission to have a personal life. She works for me. Reed's words were flat, final, vibrating with possessive certainty. Everything about her life is my business, because her choices have security implications for my household. So yes, Flynn, she absolutely needs permission, and she didn't ask for it. Sawyer's face flushed with anger and humiliation. We're done. We're not having this conversation here. She grabbed her clutch from the table. Flynn, I'm so sorry. I'll call you. No. Reed's hand shot out, catching her wrist not painfully, but firmly enough to stop her movement. You don't need to do anything except finish this dinner, go home, and be ready to discuss this situation properly tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. in my office, where we'll establish new boundaries that prevent future and misunderstandings. He released her wrist and turned his attention to Flynn James, who'd gone pale. Enjoy your evening, but understand that any future contact with Sawyer requires my explicit approval. For security purposes, of course. This was only the beginning of a much bigger war. Reed walked away before either of them could respond, his exit as controlled as his entrance despite the chaos raging inside him. He'd just violated every professional boundary, exposed his obsession to witnesses, and turned a simple dinner into a public display of possessive jealousy that his enemies would hear about by morning. And he didn't care. Because Sawyer Lee worked for him, and if Reed Stone had lost his mind over seeing her with someone else, he'd burn down the entire city before letting her go. Sawyer arrived at exactly 7 a.m., as she had every morning for 8 months, but this time her hands trembled slightly as she used her keycard to access the penthouse's private elevator. She'd barely slept after the restaurant disaster, replaying Reed Stone's possessive declaration and the humiliation of watching Flynn leave their ruined date with confusion and concern etched across his too kind face. She'd texted Flynn an apology he probably didn't understand, then spent the night alternating between fury at Reed's overreach and genuine fear that she was about to lose the best-paying job she'd ever secured. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse's main living area, and Sawyer stepped out expecting to begin her normal routine coffee first, then the kitchen, then systematic progression through Reed's meticulously organized space. Instead, Marcus stood waiting, his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant he knew exactly what was coming and felt some degree of sympathy he'd never expressed verbally. "He wants you in his office," Marcus said quietly. Immediately. What he didn't know was that someone was watching. Sawyer's stomach dropped, but she kept her face composed. "Of course." She set down her cleaning caddy and followed Marcus through the expansive living area toward Reed's private office, a space she cleaned weekly but had never entered while Reed occupied it. Marcus knocked once, then opened the door without waiting for response. "She's here, boss." Reed sat behind a massive desk of black walnut, his presence filling the room despite the office's generous dimensions. He'd changed from last night's fury into something colder and more dangerous, the version of Reed Stone, who negotiated territorial contracts and eliminated threats without visible emotion. His slate-gray eyes tracked Sawyer's entrance with predatory focus, and when he spoke, his voice carried the controlled authority of someone who expected absolute compliance. "Close the door, Marcus." "Sawyer, sit." Sawyer remained standing. "Mr. Stone, if this is about last night, sit." Not louder but harder, the single word carrying enough weight that Sawyer's knees bent instinctively before her pride could override survival instinct. She lowered herself into the chair across from his desk, spine straight, hands folded in her lap to hide their shaking. He trusted her, and that was his biggest mistake. Reed leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, studying her with the intensity of someone cataloging weaknesses for future exploitation. "Let's discuss security protocols. Specifically, the clause in your employment contract regarding background checks and disclosure of personal relationships that might compromise household security." "I read my contract, Mr. Stone. There's no clause requiring disclosure of personal relationships. There's a clause requiring you to avoid conflicts of interest and security vulnerabilities. Dating someone with no security vetting, someone who now knows where you work and potentially has access to information about my residence, my schedule, my movements, that's a vulnerability." Reed's tone was clinical, professional, and completely undermined by the way his jaw tightened when he said the word dating. Sawyer felt anger override caution. "Flynn James is a high school math teacher with no criminal record and no interest in your business operations. The only security risk he represents is to your ego, because apparently seeing your housekeeper have a personal life threatens some kind of territorial instinct you're disguising as professional concern. One wrong move, and everything would fall apart." The silence that followed was absolute. Reed's eyes darkened, his fingers unclenching and then curling into fists on the desk's surface. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something dangerous. "Careful, Sawyer. You're correct that your contract doesn't explicitly forbid personal relationships, but it does allow me to terminate employment if I determine your judgment represents a security liability. And right now, your judgment is deeply concerning. Because I went on a date? Because you went on a date without informing me of a new relationship that affects your availability, your focus, your potential vulnerabilities to external pressure." Reed stood, moving around the desk with controlled precision. "What if Flynn James isn't what he appears? What if he's using you to gather intelligence? What if rivals identified you as a weak point, and he's the infiltration? Then your background check would have revealed it," Sawyer countered, standing to maintain some semblance of equal footing. But it didn't, because Flynn is exactly what he appears to be, a normal person living a normal life, something you clearly can't tolerate in your staff. Reed moved closer, eliminating the professional distance between employer and employee. What I can't tolerate is being blindsided. What I can't tolerate is discovering that someone with daily access to my private space is developing relationships I know nothing about. What I can't tolerate, he stopped himself, visibly wrestling with words that wanted to emerge but couldn't be justified through professional framework. What you can't tolerate is not controlling every aspect of your employee's existence. Sawyer finished quietly. But Mr. Stone, I don't owe you my personal life. I show up on time. I do exceptional work. I maintain confidentiality. And I've never given you reason to question my loyalty or judgment. What I do during my off hours is none of your business, regardless of how much it might offend your sense of ownership over everything in your territory. If people who tear others down for existing make your blood boil like they do mine, hit that subscribe button and join us. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Let's stand together against everyone who's ever made someone feel worthless. Reed's hand shot out, catching her wrist not painfully, but firmly, the touch electric in ways that had nothing to do with professional authority. Everything in my territory is my business. And you, Sawyer Lee, are very much in my territory. Sawyer pulled her wrist free, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then fire me, because I won't apologize for having a life outside these walls, and I won't ask your permission to spend time with decent people who treat me like a human being instead of a security risk. She turned toward the door, half expecting Reed to physically prevent her departure, but he let her go, his voice following her retreat. You're not fired. But understand this, any future developments in your personal life get disclosed to me immediately. That's not negotiable. And Sawyer? Flynn James will be monitored, for security purposes. Sawyer left without responding, her professional composure fracturing the moment she reached the elevator. Reed Stone had just made her personal life his operational concern, and they both knew it had nothing to do with security, and everything to do with the possessive fury she'd seen in his eyes when he'd said those 3 devastating words. She works for me. The assignment came via text at 11 p.m., 3 days after the office confrontation. Sawyer was in her small apartment, finally allowing herself to relax after 72 hours of Reed's cold, controlled distance that somehow felt more threatening than his restaurant outburst. She'd exchanged brief messages with Flynn, apologetic explanations, that her employer was difficult and overprotective, and they'd tentatively rescheduled dinner for Friday night. The thought of normal conversation with someone uncomplicated had sustained her through Reed's oppressive silence. Then her phone buzzed. Emergency deep clean required. Penthouse hosting high-value associates Friday through Sunday. Need complete refresh of all guest suites, kitchen deep sanitization, full inventory of linens and supplies. Begin tomorrow 6 a.m., plan for round-the-clock availability through weekend. Overtime compensated accordingly. RS. But this wasn't even the most shocking part. Sawyer stared at the message, her hands clenching around her phone hard enough that the case creaked. Friday through Sunday. The exact window of her rescheduled date with Flynn. The timing wasn't coincidental. Reed Stone didn't do coincidence. This was retaliation disguised as legitimate work requirement, forcing her to choose between employment and personal life in ways he could justify through professional necessity. She typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on cold professionalism. Understood. Will begin at 6 a.m. Reed's response was immediate. Good. Marcus will provide security details since you'll be working extended hours. Can't have my staff vulnerable during high-stakes hosting. The security detail wasn't protection, it was monitoring, making sure she stayed exactly where Reed wanted her, eliminating any possibility of leaving for personal commitments. Sawyer wanted to throw her phone across the room, wanted to quit via text message, and let Reed Stone find someone else to manipulate through professional authority. But the salary he paid was 3 times market rate, and the money she'd saved was her only path to eventual independence. So she texted Flynn, I'm so sorry. Work emergency this weekend. My boss is hosting important clients and needs full-time coverage. Can we reschedule? Flynn's response was understanding, kind, everything Reed Stone wasn't. Of course. Your boss sounds intense, but I get it. How about next week? Sawyer didn't answer. She wasn't sure there would be a next week. Wasn't sure Reed would ever allow her personal life to exist without his interference. He couldn't explain why, but danger was closing in. The weekend that followed was exactly as Reed had designed it. Exhausting. All-consuming. Strategically impossible. The guest suites didn't need deep cleaning. They were already immaculate. But Reed's instructions were absurdly specific. Hand wash every piece of crystal. Reorganize the kitchen inventory alphabetically. Polish silver that hadn't been used in months. Steam clean furniture that showed no visible wear. And through it all, Reed was there, not helping, just present, working from his office with the door open, taking calls in the living room while Sawyer cleaned around him, appearing in doorways with new requirements delivered in that controlled, professional tone that somehow felt more intimate than kindness. By Friday evening, Sawyer understood the real purpose. This wasn't about cleaning. This was about proximity, about forcing her to exist in his space during hours when she should have been building a life elsewhere. Reed was erasing her external existence through professional demands, and the worst part was knowing she couldn't prove it was personal rather than legitimate business necessity. That moment, everything in the room changed. Saturday night, close to midnight, Sawyer was polishing the kitchen's copper accents when Reed entered with 2 glasses of whiskey. He set one near her hand without comment, then leaned against the counter with his own drink, watching her work with that unsettling focus she'd learned to expect. "You're doing excellent work," he said finally, the words carrying subtext that had nothing to do with cleaning. Sawyer didn't look up. "Thank you, Mr. Stone. When's your next date with Flynn?" Direct, blunt, shattering any pretense of professional distance. "I don't have one scheduled, because you made sure of that," remained unspoken but obvious. "Good." Reed took a slow sip of whiskey. "The associates I'm hosting this weekend, they're dangerous men, evaluating whether my operation is secure enough for partnership. Having my staff distracted by external relationships during critical negotiations would be problematic." Sawyer's hand stilled on the copper. "Is that what this is? Professional necessity? Or is this punishment for having dinner with someone you didn't approve?" Reed's smile was sharp enough to cut. Can't it be both? For the first time, he wasn't in control. The honesty was somehow more infuriating than lies. Sawyer turned to face him fully, exhaustion and anger finally overriding caution. "What exactly do you want from me, Mr. Stone? Because I can't figure out if you're trying to control my personal life or eliminate it entirely." "I want—" Reed stopped, visibly wrestling with words that wanted to emerge, but couldn't be justified through employer-employee framework. "I want to know that when I need you here, you're available, not scheduling dates, not planning escapes, not building a life that takes you away from," he caught himself, "from your responsibilities." "From you," Sawyer corrected quietly. "You mean away from you?" Reed's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he set down his whiskey and moved closer, invading her personal space in ways that should have felt threatening but somehow felt inevitable. "You're exhausted. Take tomorrow morning off. Sleep in the guest suite. Start fresh at noon." It was consideration disguised as continued control, making sure she remained in his territory even during rest. Sawyer should have refused, should have insisted on returning to her own apartment where Reed's influence couldn't follow. But she was too tired to fight, too worn down by 72 hours of strategic proximity and manufactured necessity. Fine. She abandoned the copper polish and moved toward the guest wing, Reed's presence following her departure like a physical weight. He didn't want revenge. He needed it. In the guest suite's privacy, Sawyer finally allowed herself to acknowledge what she'd been avoiding. Reed Stone wasn't trying to eliminate her personal life through professional demands. He was trying to eliminate it because seeing her with someone else had triggered something he didn't understand and couldn't control. And somehow, that was more dangerous than simple employer overreach, because Sawyer was starting to realize that the fury in Reed's voice, when he'd said "she works for me," hadn't been about employment. It had been about possession. The comprehensive background report arrived on Reed's desk Monday morning, delivered by Marcus with an expression that suggested he knew exactly how inappropriate this investigation was, but valued his employment too much to comment directly. Reed opened the folder with hands that remained steady through decades of practice controlling physical tells, then proceeded to absorb every documented detail of Flynn James's aggressively normal existence. Education, State University, mathematics degree, teaching credential. Employment: 7 years at Eastbridge Academy, consistently positive reviews, moderate salary that would never provide luxury but ensured stability. Residence: 2-bedroom condo purchased 3 years ago, modest neighborhood with good schools and low crime. Relationships: 1 serious girlfriend in college, amicable breakup, currently single and apparently genuinely interested in Sawyer based on the frequency of his text messages. Hobbies: weekend hiking, community theater, volunteers tutoring underprivileged students in mathematics. There was one detail everyone missed: Reed closed the folder and resisted the urge to set it on fire. Flynn James was exactly what the preliminary report had indicated: thoroughly decent, stable, safe. The kind of man who offered women uncomplicated futures without bodyguards or territorial wars, or the constant calculation of threat assessment. The kind of man Sawyer could build a normal life with, complete with weekend brunches and parent-teacher conferences and retirement planning. The kind of man Reed could never be, no matter how much money or power he accumulated. And that realization was more devastating than any business failure or territorial loss Reed had experienced in his brutal climb to control. He wasn't competing against a dangerous rival he could eliminate through traditional means. He was competing against normalcy itself, the promise of a life where Sawyer could relax without hypervigilance, where her biggest concern would be mortgage payments, instead of whether her employer's enemies might use her as leverage. Reed should have been relieved that Flynn represented no security threat. Instead, he felt something close to despair, because now he couldn't justify his interference through professional concerns. This was pure, irrational jealousy, wanting to eliminate a good man's pursuit of Sawyer simply because Reed couldn't tolerate the thought of her happiness existing beyond his reach. And suddenly he realized he was being played. He was still staring at the closed folder when Sawyer entered his office with fresh coffee, her movements carrying the efficient professionalism that had defined their relationship for 8 months. She set the cup on his desk without meeting his eyes, then turned to leave before he could manufacture reasons to extend the interaction. "Wait." Reed's voice stopped her at the door. "I need to discuss something with you." Sawyer turned back, her expression carefully neutral. "Of course, Mr. Stone." Reed gestured to the chair across from his desk, the same seat where he'd interrogated her about security risks days earlier. Sawyer sat with visible reluctance, spine straight, hands folded, every inch of her body language screaming defensive distance. "I received the background report on Flynn James," Reed began, watching Sawyer's face for reaction. She went very still, her eyes flashing with anger before she schooled her expression back to professional composure. "Of course you did, because apparently my personal relationships require intelligence gathering." "Security protocols," Reed started. But Sawyer cut him off with uncharacteristic directness. "Stop lying to both of us. This isn't about security. If it were, you'd have investigated every person I've interacted with in 8 months, not just the one man who took me to dinner. This is about control, Mr. Stone. About ensuring that nothing in your territory exists without your knowledge and approval." His right-hand man had been hiding something from him. Reed leaned back in his chair, studying her with that predatory focus she'd learned to endure. "You're right. It's not entirely about security, but it's also not simple control for its own sake." "Then what is it?" The question hung between them, demanding honesty Reed wasn't sure he could provide without destroying the last pretense of professional relationship. He looked at Sawyer, really looked at her, not as the invisible housekeeper who maintained his space, but as the woman who'd laughed with genuine freedom on a street corner, who'd touched another man's arm with easy affection, who'd built a private life so carefully compartmentalized that Reed had never noticed its existence until it threatened to take her away from him. "Flynn James is a good man," Reed said finally, the admission costing him. "Clean background, stable employment, genuine intentions. He represents exactly the kind of safe, normal future that someone in your position should pursue. No danger, no complications, no constant threat assessment required, just ordinary happiness." Sawyer's expression shifted from anger to confusion. "I don't understand. If you've confirmed he's not a threat, why are you still—" She stopped, realization dawning across her face. "You're not worried about him being dangerous. You're worried about him being exactly what he appears to be." Reed's hands curled into fists on his desk. "I'm worried about you choosing ordinary happiness over—" He caught himself before completing the sentence, before admitting that he wanted her to choose his dangerous world over Flynn's safe one, wanted her to prioritize proximity to him over the freedom to build a normal life. But he had no idea a bigger force was controlling everything. "Over what?" Sawyer pressed, leaning forward slightly. "Over working for you? Over remaining your invisible housekeeper who exists only during business hours? That's not a choice, Mr. Stone. That's an employment arrangement with absolutely no claim on my personal happiness." "I know." The words came out rougher than Reed intended. "I know I have no right to interfere, no justification for the way I've been manipulating your schedule and invading your privacy. I know that every professional boundary I've violated in the past week has been inappropriate and potentially actionable. But Sawyer," he stood, moving around the desk with controlled intensity. "Knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally are different things. And I'm discovering that watching you build a life with someone else is something I can't accept, regardless of how irrational that makes me. Sawyer stood as well, maintaining distance but no longer retreating. Why? Why does it matter to you what I do outside these walls? You've barely acknowledged my existence for 8 months. I've been furniture, a function, a service you pay for and forget about the moment I leave. So why now? Why does seeing me happy with someone else suddenly make you lose your mind? Reed opened his mouth to provide some professional justification, some strategic explanation that would preserve plausible deniability. But looking at Sawyer's face, genuinely confused and genuinely angry, he found he couldn't lie anymore. The truth was too large, too consuming, too obvious to everyone, including himself. Because I've been lying to myself for 8 months about what you actually mean to me, Reed said quietly. And seeing you with Flynn James shattered that lie so completely that I can't reconstruct it, no matter how much more convenient it would be for both of us. This choice would define the rest of his life. The silence that followed was absolute. Sawyer stared at him with an expression that cycled through shock, disbelief, and something that might have been unwilling understanding. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. This is completely inappropriate. I know. You're my employer. There's a massive power imbalance. Anything between us would be ethically. I know. And you're telling me anyway? Despite knowing that this confession puts me in an impossible position where I can't refuse you without risking my employment? Sawyer's anger was returning, sharpening her words. That's not honest, Mr. Stone. That's manipulation disguised as vulnerability. You're right. Reed forced himself to step back, to create physical distance that might restore some semblance of professional boundary. You're absolutely right. Which is why I'm going to stop interfering with Flynn James. Stop manufacturing reasons to keep you here. Stop investigating your personal life and trying to control your happiness through professional authority. Sawyer's expression suggested she didn't believe him. Just like that? You're going to suddenly develop appropriate boundaries? No, Reed admitted. I'm going to fail repeatedly, probably catastrophically. But I'll try. Because the alternative is becoming the kind of man who ruins your chance at ordinary happiness just because I can't offer it myself. He moved back to his desk, putting furniture between them as though physical barriers might help. Take the rest of the day off. No manufactured tasks. No strategic proximity. Go text Flynn James. Reschedule your date. Build the normal life you deserve. Sawyer didn't move toward the door. Instead, she studied Reed with that unnerving perceptiveness he'd underestimated for 8 months. What do you actually want from me, Reed? Not as your employer asking his housekeeper as a person. What do you want? The use of his first name felt intimate in ways that had nothing to do with formality. Reed met her eyes directly, abandoning the last pretense of professional distance. I want you to stay. I want you to choose this. He gestured at the penthouse, at himself, at the dangerous world he inhabited, over the safety Flynn represents. But I also want you to have the choice. Real choice without coercion or manipulation. And those two desires are fundamentally incompatible. So, what are you going to do? Sawyer's voice had softened slightly, some of her defensive anger giving way to genuine curiosity about how Reed planned to navigate this impossible situation. Suffer quietly, Reed said with dark humor. While hoping you're foolish enough to choose the dangerous option, despite every rational reason to pursue normalcy. Sawyer laughed, a small, surprised sound that transformed her expression completely. You're actually being honest. I didn't think you were capable of it. Neither did I. Reed allowed himself a slight smile. Turns out jealousy is an excellent truth serum. Makes you say things you'd normally die before admitting. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for family. They stood there in charged silence. 8 months of professional distance dissolving into something far more complicated and dangerous. Finally, Sawyer moved toward the door, but she paused at the threshold, looking back with an expression Reed couldn't quite interpret. For what it's worth, she said quietly. I don't want ordinary happiness. I never have. That's why I took a job in your world instead of settling for something safer. I just needed to know if you saw me as a person or a function. Now I know. She left before Reed could respond, before he could ask what that knowledge meant for her choices going forward. But something in his chest loosened slightly, some desperate hope emerging from the certainty of loss. Maybe Sawyer Lee was foolish enough to choose danger after all. The power failed at midnight on Tuesday during a thunderstorm that hit with unexpected violence, plunging the penthouse into darkness before the backup generators kicked in 30 seconds later, with dim emergency lighting that cast everything in unsettling shadows. Reed was working in his office when the building's structural systems roared to life, providing enough electricity for essential functions, but leaving the residents in atmospheric gloom that would have been romantic if circumstances were different. He found Sawyer in the kitchen, standing frozen near the counter with her phone's flashlight illuminating cleaning supplies scattered across the granite. She'd been working late, her choice. She'd insisted when Reed suggested earlier that she could leave at her normal time, and now she was trapped in his space during a storm that howled against the floor-to-ceiling windows like nature demonstrating its opinion on their complicated dynamic. Generator will maintain emergency power for 72 hours if needed, Reed said from the doorway, keeping his voice calm and factual. Building management says full power should be restored within 6 hours. You can stay in the guest suite rather than trying to get home in this weather. Sawyer didn't turn around. I'll be fine. I can. Thunder cracked loud enough to rattle the windows, and the emergency lights flickered ominously before stabilizing. Sawyer's shoulders went rigid, her hand tightening around her phone hard enough that Reed saw her knuckles go white even in the dim lighting. You're staying, Reed said, no longer framing it as suggestion. Even if you made it to street level, no car service is operating in these conditions. It's not safe. Since when do you care about my safety outside business hours? Sawyer's words carried bite, but Reed heard exhaustion underneath emotional more than physical, the cumulative weight of their impossible situation finally showing cracks in her professional composure. Since always, Reed admitted quietly. I've just been lying about it through employer-employee distance. What followed next was completely unexpected. Another thundercrack. This one close enough that the building's structural steel seemed to resonate. Sawyer turned finally, her face partially illuminated by phone light, and Reed saw something vulnerable in her expression. Not fear of the storm, but fear of everything the storm represented. Being trapped in close proximity with a man who'd confessed inappropriate feelings, navigating attraction that violated every professional boundary, acknowledging that the past week's tension had shifted something fundamental between them. I'll make tea, Reed said, moving into the kitchen with deliberate casualness. Unless you prefer something stronger, tea is fine. Sawyer watched him navigate the dark kitchen with practiced ease, filling the kettle and setting it on the gas stove that didn't require electricity. You don't have to entertain me. I can just sit. Reed gestured to the bar stools, his tone carrying enough authority that Sawyer obeyed before thinking better of it. And stop pretending this isn't deeply awkward for both of us. We can either acknowledge the elephant in the room, or continue performing professional distance that's been completely destroyed anyway. Sawyer sat, setting down her phone so it illuminated the space between them. Okay, let's acknowledge it. You've admitted you have inappropriate feelings for your housekeeper. I've admitted I took this job because I wanted to work in your world rather than something safer. And now we're trapped in close proximity during a storm that's making everything feel more dramatic than it actually is. Did I miss anything? You missed the part where you're supposed to tell me whether you're still planning dates with Flynn James. Reed poured water into teacups with steady hands, despite the tension vibrating through his body. Because I've been trying not to ask, trying to respect your autonomy, but the not knowing is driving me insane. He texted earlier, asked if I was free this weekend. Sawyer accepted the tea. Reed handed her, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. I haven't responded yet. Reed's jaw tightened. Why not? Because I'm trying to figure out what I actually want versus what seems safest. Sawyer took a careful sip of tea, using the action to avoid eye contact. Flynn is everything you said: stable, kind, offering exactly the kind of uncomplicated future that someone in my position should pursue. And then there's... She gestured vaguely at Reed, at the penthouse, at the dangerous world he represented. He should have walked away, but then he saw it. And then there's me, Reed finished, offering nothing but complications, danger, and the certainty that choosing this world means giving up any pretense of normal happiness. Is that what you think you're offering? Just danger and complications? Sawyer looked at him directly now, her eyes reflecting the phone's light. Because from where I'm sitting, you're offering something else entirely, something I've never had and don't quite know how to name. Reed's hands curled around his own teacup, the porcelain's heat grounding him against the urge to eliminate the space between them. What am I offering, Sawyer? Being seen. The words came out quietly, carrying weight that had nothing to do with volume. For 8 months, I was invisible to you, a function you paid for and forgot about. But the moment you saw me with someone else, suddenly I became visible in ways that are terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. You actually see me now, not just as your housekeeper, but as a person whose choices matter, whose happiness affects you. whose presence in your life is something you can't ignore anymore. I always saw you, Reed countered, the lie transparent even as he said it. You just pretended not to see me, because acknowledging that I existed as a person, rather than a function, would have complicated things. Sawyer set down her tea with enough force that liquid sloshed near the rim. But you can't pretend anymore. And honestly, neither can I. But this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. The admission hung between them, charged with implication. Reed forced himself to stay seated, to maintain the physical distance that was their last defense against completely destroying professional boundaries. What does that mean? That you can't pretend? It means I don't want ordinary happiness with Flynn James. Sawyer's voice was steady now, certain. I never did. I wanted to want it. Wanted to be the kind of person who could build a normal life with a decent man who offers stability and safety. But the truth is, I've been attracted to danger my entire life. That's why I applied for a job in your world, instead of finding something safer. That's why I stayed even when it became clear that you were controlling and possessive, and completely inappropriate. And that's why watching you lose your mind over seeing me with someone else felt more right than any healthy relationship I've ever attempted. Reed stood abruptly, the movement sharp enough that Sawyer startled. But he didn't approach her. Instead, he moved to the window, staring out at the storm, battering Manhattan with enough force to make even reinforced glass vibrate. That's not love, Sawyer. That's attraction to toxicity disguised as excitement. And I can't let you make that choice without making absolutely sure you understand what you're choosing. Then tell me. Sawyer stood as well, moving closer but not touching. Tell me exactly what I'd be choosing if I stayed in your world, not as your housekeeper, but as whatever this is between us. Are you Team Sawyer and Reed? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Reed turned from the window, his face half-shadowed in the emergency lighting, and for the first time since she'd known him, Sawyer saw something close to vulnerability in his expression. You'd be choosing constant danger, rivals who would use you as leverage, security protocols that limit your freedom, a man who's spent decades building walls around himself and doesn't actually know how to let someone in without trying to control every variable. You'd be choosing someone who lost his mind seeing you laugh with another man because somewhere in the past 8 months, you became the only thing that feels like home in a world built entirely on strategy and survival. The confession was raw enough that Sawyer felt something crack in her own careful defenses. You think that would be easy for me? Becoming that vulnerable to someone like you? No. I think it would be the hardest thing you've ever done, which is why I'm trying to give you an escape route. Reed moved closer, finally closing the distance between them until they were standing inches apart. Go back to Flynn, James. Build the normal life. Text me your resignation in the morning if that makes it easier. But Sawyer, if you stay, if you choose this, I need you to understand that I don't know how to do relationships without possession. I don't know how to care about someone without trying to control every aspect of their safety and happiness. And I'm terrified that loving me will destroy exactly what I love about you, your independence, your strength, your refusal to be diminished by powerful men. Sawyer reached up, her hand catching Reed's jaw, forcing him to meet her eyes. Then learn how to love someone without owning them. Learn how to care without controlling. And I'll learn how to be with someone powerful without losing myself. We'll both be terrible at it initially, probably catastrophically so. But Reed, I'd rather fail at something real with you than succeed at performing normalcy with someone else. He didn't realize this moment would come back to haunt him. The kiss happened before either of them could second-guess the decision, desperate and claiming and absolutely inevitable, after a week of manufactured proximity and forced restraint. Reed's hands came up to frame Sawyer's face, gentle despite the intensity of everything else about him, and Sawyer melted into the contact like she'd been waiting 8 months for permission to stop maintaining professional distance. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Reed rested his forehead against hers. This is a terrible idea. I know. We're going to hurt each other. Probably repeatedly. Probably. And I'm still going to be possessive and controlling and completely inappropriate. And I'm still going to push back and demand respect and refuse to be diminished. Sawyer smiled slightly. But at least now we're being honest about what we're choosing. Reed pulled back enough to study her face, looking for doubt or fear or second thoughts. Finding only certainty, he exhaled shakily. Stay tonight. In the guest suite, nothing else. I'm not enough of a bastard to pressure you during a storm when you can't leave. But stay so I can wake up tomorrow knowing you chose to be here. Not because I manufactured work or manipulated your schedule. I'll stay. Sawyer kissed him once more, softer this time. But Reed? Tomorrow we start figuring out how this actually works. The boundaries, the power dynamics, how to navigate employer-employee complications, all of it. Tomorrow, Reed agreed. Tonight, we just exist in the same space without pretending you're invisible or I'm unaffected. They stood there in the storm-darkened kitchen, the emergency lights casting them in dramatic shadows. Two people who'd just chosen the most complicated possible path forward, but were somehow certain it was the right one. Outside, thunder continued rolling across Manhattan, nature approving of their messy, dangerous choice. The flowers arrived at 10 a.m. on Wednesday, delivered to the penthouse lobby with enough dramatic flair that the building's concierge called Reed's private line before allowing them into the elevator. 24 white roses arranged in a crystal vase, accompanied by a card written in neat, earnest handwriting. Sawyer, I know your boss is intense, but I'd really like to see you again when things calm down. Thinking about you, Flynn. Hidden in the files was a secret that could destroy them all. Reed stared at the arrangement sitting on his desk where Marcus had placed it with an expression that mixed amusement and concern, and felt every muscle in his body tighten with possessive fury that had no rational justification. Sawyer had chosen him. She'd stayed during the storm, kissed him with desperate certainty, agreed to navigate the messy complications of actually being together. Flynn James was a non-issue, a remnant of the week when Sawyer had been trying to want normal happiness instead of acknowledging her attraction to danger. Except now Flynn was sending flowers to Reed's building, publicly declaring continued interest in a woman who technically still worked as Reed's housekeeper, creating exactly the kind of visible complication that Reed's world didn't tolerate. Rivals who saw those flowers would see weakness, the Mafia Boss whose staff was being actively courted by outsiders, suggesting Reed couldn't maintain control over his own territory. The territorial response was automatic, visceral, completely overriding the rational understanding that Sawyer had already made her choice. Reed was midway through composing a text to Sawyer demanding she handle Flynn's persistence immediately when she entered his office with coffee and morning reports, her expression shifting from professional to wary the moment she spotted the roses. "Oh," was all she said, a single syllable carrying complicated recognition. "Oh?" Reed's voice was dangerously quiet. "That's your response to your other suitor sending flowers to my building?" Sawyer set down the coffee with deliberate care. "Flynn isn't my other suitor. He's a decent man who doesn't know that circumstances have changed. I'll text him, explain that I'm seeing someone, and ask him to respect that boundary. It's a 5-minute conversation that doesn't require," she gestured at Reed's rigid posture, at the fury evident despite his controlled expression, "whatever territorial response you're currently fighting." What she found in the envelope froze her in place. "He sent flowers to my building." Reed's hands curled into fists on his desk. "To my territory, where my associates and rivals can see that you're receiving romantic attention from men I haven't approved. Do you understand how that makes me look? How that suggests I can't even control my own household?" Sawyer's expression hardened. "We agreed yesterday to work on boundaries, to figure out how you can care about me without trying to own every aspect of my existence. And here we are, not even 24 hours later, with you treating Flynn's flowers like a territorial violation that requires immediate dominance response." "It is a territorial violation." "No," Sawyer interrupted, her voice sharp. "It's a man sending flowers to someone he likes, operating on incomplete information because I haven't communicated that situation has changed. The violation is in your head, Reed. The threat is imaginary. And if you can't recognize the difference between actual security concerns and irrational jealousy, then we're going to have serious problems." Reed stood, moving around the desk with controlled intensity that made Sawyer take an instinctive step back. "You're right. The threat is imaginary. Flynn James represents no actual danger to me or my operations. But watching you receive romantic gestures from another man still makes me want to eliminate him as a problem, despite knowing that impulse is completely irrational and inappropriate. So what are you going to do about it?" Sawyer held her ground despite Reed's proximity, despite the dangerous energy radiating from him. "Are you going to respect my ability to handle this like an adult? Or are you going to default to the controlling, possessive behavior that makes you feel safe but makes me feel owned?" The question cut deeper than Reed wanted to admit. He'd spent the past 12 hours telling himself he could learn to love Sawyer without trying to control every variable of her safety and happiness. But faced with concrete evidence of another man's interest flowers that represented the normal courtship Sawyer had rejected in favor of choosing Reed's dangerous world, every protective, possessive instinct Reed possessed was screaming at him to eliminate the perceived threat through whatever means necessary. Under the floorboard, he discovered a truth he wasn't ready for. "I want to throw those flowers off the balcony," Reed admitted, his honesty raw. I want to have Marcus deliver a message to Flynn James that makes very clear he's no longer welcome to pursue you. I want to mark you as mine so visibly that no other man would even consider approaching you. And I absolutely know that all those impulses are toxic and controlling and exactly the behavior you warned me about. But Sawyer, knowing something intellectually and managing the emotional response are completely different things. Sawyer's expression softened fractionally. I'm not asking you to feel differently. I'm asking you to act differently despite how you feel. To let me handle Flynn instead of trying to eliminate a problem that doesn't actually exist. She moved closer, her hand finding Reed's chest where she could feel his heart hammering. I chose you. Yesterday, during the storm, I chose the dangerous option over the safe one. But I need you to trust that choice. Trust that I'm not going to be swayed by flowers or persistence, or the promise of ordinary happiness. Reed's hand covered hers, pressing it harder against his chest. What if I can't trust that? What if the fear of losing you overrides rational judgment every time someone else shows interest? Then we're going to fight. A lot. And you're going to have to learn to sit with that discomfort instead of trying to control it away. Sawyer's voice carried certainty that shouldn't have been reassuring but somehow was. I'm not fragile, Reed. I'm not going to shatter the moment someone offers me an alternative, but I also won't tolerate being treated like property you're defending rather than a person making active choices. Reed closed his eyes, fighting the war between territorial instinct and genuine desire to be better than his worst impulses. Text Flynn. Tell him the situation has changed. Do it now, while I'm standing here trying not to throw his flowers out the window. Sawyer pulled out her phone, typed quickly, then held the screen so Reed could see the message. Flynn, thank you for the flowers, but I need to be honest with you. My situation has changed, and I'm seeing someone. I appreciate your kindness, but I can't pursue anything with you. I hope you understand. Sawyer. She hit send, then pocketed her phone and looked at Reed with expectation. Your turn. Tell me you're satisfied with my handling of this. Tell me you trust me enough to let this go without needing additional dominance displays or territorial marking. Reed pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with desperate intensity. I'm satisfied with your handling. I trust you. And I'm going to really try to let this go without doing something catastrophic. He paused, then added with dark humor. But I'm still keeping the flowers. As a reminder of what happens when I let irrational jealousy override strategic thinking. Sawyer laughed against his chest. You're keeping flowers from my other suitor as a memento of your possessive insecurity. That's possibly the most ridiculous thing you've ever said. Welcome to dating someone with control issues. Reed's smile was slight but genuine. It's going to be a disaster. You should probably run while you still can. Too late. Sawyer tilted her head up to kiss him. I'm committed to this disaster now. But Reed, next time you feel the urge to eliminate perceived threats through territorial violence, try talking to me first. I promise I'm much better at handling my own life than you are at trying to control it. For once, he wasn't thinking like a boss, but like a man about to lose everything. Reed kissed her back, knowing she was right and knowing he'd probably fail catastrophically at following that advice next time something triggered his possessive instincts. But for now, with Sawyer in his arms and Flynn's flowers serving as expensive reminder of his worst impulses, he was willing to try learning how to love someone without needing to own every aspect of their existence. It would be a long, difficult process. But watching Sawyer smile at him genuine and unguarded, and choosing him despite every rational reason to run, Reed thought maybe it was actually possible. He just needed to remember that the woman in his arms was stronger than his need to control her. The confrontation happened at midnight on Friday, when Sawyer was preparing to leave after a long day, and Reed's control finally shattered completely. He'd spent 3 days trying to navigate appropriate boundaries, trying to respect Sawyer's autonomy, trying to be something other than the controlling, possessive bastard who'd lost his mind seeing her with another man. But watching her gather her things, preparing to return to her own apartment, triggered something primal that overrode every good intention he'd been carefully maintaining. Don't go. Reed's voice stopped Sawyer at the elevator, the words carrying desperate edge that had nothing to do with employer authority. Not tonight. Not to that apartment where I can't. He caught himself, recognizing how his sentence was about to reveal the depth of his need to control her movements. Sawyer turned slowly, her expression shifting from surprise to wary. Reed, we agreed I'd maintain my own space, that we'd navigate this slowly rather than rushing into living together just because it's convenient. I know what we agreed. Reed moved closer, eliminating the distance between them with predatory focus. And I've really been trying to respect those boundaries. But Sawyer, I can't do this. Can't watch you leave every night knowing you're out there without protection, without me knowing if you're safe, without... He stopped himself again, frustrated by his inability to articulate feelings he'd spent decades suppressing. Without your control? Sawyer finished quietly. That's what you mean. You can't handle not knowing every detail of my existence, not having surveillance on my movements, not being able to monitor who I see and where I go. He knew something that no one else in the building did. Yes. Reed's honesty was brutal. I hate it. I hate every second you're outside my territory where I can't ensure your safety. And I absolutely know that's toxic and controlling and exactly the behavior you warned me about. But acknowledging it's wrong doesn't make the feeling go away. Sawyer set down her bag with deliberate care. So what are you asking for? Complete surrender of my independence? Moving into your penthouse where you can maintain 24/7 surveillance? Giving up every aspect of my life that exists beyond your immediate control? I'm asking. Reed caught himself. Forced himself to actually think about what he was asking versus what his territorial instincts were screaming for. I'm asking you to help me understand why I feel this way. Why seeing you leave triggers panic that has nothing to do with rational security concerns and everything to do with some irrational fear that you won't come back. The admission was vulnerable enough that Sawyer's defensive posture softened slightly. You're afraid I'll realize this was a mistake, that I'll wake up tomorrow and decide the safe. The normal option was actually the right choice all along. Yes. Reed's hands curled into fists at his sides. Because you should realize that. You should absolutely wake up and recognize that choosing me over stability and safety was an emotional decision made during a storm, when everything felt dramatic and inevitable. You should run, Sawyer, and the fact that you haven't yet makes me convinced it's only a matter of time before you do. What she said next shattered his trust instantly. Sawyer moved closer, her hands finding Reed's chest where she could feel his heart hammering. So this isn't about control. It's about fear. You're trying to bind me so tightly to your territory that leaving becomes impossible, because you don't actually believe I'd choose to stay otherwise. Reed closed his eyes, her words cutting deeper than any accusation of possessiveness. I don't know how to believe it. Don't know how to trust that you see something worth staying for beneath the danger and complications. Everyone in my world stays because of money or fear or strategic alliance. No one stays because they actually want to be here. And you, his voice roughened. You could have normalcy, could have Flynn, James, and his weekend hikes and his safe, predictable future. So why the hell would you choose this, unless I'm somehow coercing you through power dynamics you can't fully refuse? Because I don't want normalcy. Sawyer's voice carried absolute certainty. Because I've spent my entire life being told I should want safety and stability, when what I actually crave is intensity and danger, and feeling alive in ways that terrified me until I met you. Because watching you lose your mind over seeing me with someone else was the first time anyone has ever cared enough to be irrational about me. And because... She pulled Reed's face down to hers, forcing eye contact. Because beneath all your control and possession and territorial instincts, I see someone who's terrified of being vulnerable. And I'd rather navigate that terror with you than perform happiness with someone who never challenges me to be more than safe. Reed kissed her with desperate intensity, his hands tangling in her hair, every carefully maintained boundary dissolving beneath the weight of vulnerability he couldn't afford but couldn't avoid. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. I need to tell you something, Reed said, his voice raw. About why I operate the way I do. About the world you're choosing to exist in if you stay with me. Sawyer pulled back slightly, her expression shifting to serious focus. Okay. Tell me. Reed moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, staring out at the city he controlled through carefully constructed networks of loyalty, fear, and strategic advantage. I built this empire from nothing. No family connections, no inherited wealth, just willingness to be more ruthless than anyone else trying to claim territory. And I learned early that caring about people makes you vulnerable, gives rivals leverage they'll exploit without hesitation. He paused, gathering words he'd never spoken aloud. 10 years ago, I cared about someone, let her into my life, my operation, my carefully guarded personal space. And rivals noticed. Used her as leverage to force concessions, threaten violence, ultimately took her as retaliation when I eliminated their leadership. She survived, I made sure of that, but she was traumatized enough that she left my world entirely, moved across the country, changed her name, built a normal life as far from me as possible. Sawyer absorbed this quietly, understanding dawning across her face. And ever since then, you've made sure no one matters enough to be used as leverage. Exactly. Staff are functions, Associates are strategic alliances. Even relationships are transactional rather than emotional. I've spent a decade building walls that ensure no one can hurt me through caring about them. Reed turned from the window, his expression carrying devastating honesty. Until I watched you laugh with Flynn James and realized I'd accidentally let someone matter, despite every defense I'd constructed to prevent exactly that vulnerability. So when you say you need to control my safety, you mean you're terrified of rivals using me as leverage the way they used her. Sawyer's voice carried understanding rather than accusation. You're not trying to own me for ownership's sake. You're trying to protect me from consequences of being connected to you. Both, Reed corrected. I'm trying to protect you, and I'm trying to own you, and I'm trying to bind you so tightly that leaving becomes impossible. They're all true simultaneously, and they're all toxic in different ways, and acknowledging that doesn't make me capable of stopping. Sawyer moved to where Reed stood, her hand finding his. Then don't stop, but be honest about what you're doing and why. Don't disguise possession as professional concern or territorial marking as security protocol. If you need me close because rivals might use me as leverage, say that. If you're binding me because you're terrified I'll leave, admit that. Just stop pretending this is about anything other than you being scared of losing something you accidentally started caring about. Reed pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with desperate intensity. I'm terrified. Constantly. And it makes me want to do catastrophic things like embed tracking devices in your phone or assign security details you don't know about or eliminate anyone who shows interest in you as preventative measure. Have you done any of those things? Sawyer's voice carried genuine curiosity rather than accusation. Not yet, but I've thought about all of them. Reed's honesty was brutal. And the only thing stopping me is knowing you'd leave the moment you discovered I'd crossed that line, which is ironic. Because the fear of you leaving is what's driving the impulse to control you in ways that would guarantee you left. Everyone thought the deal went smoothly, but they were wrong. Sawyer laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement despite the severity of the conversation. So we're both trapped in impossible situations. You're terrified of vulnerability but can't avoid it now that you care about me. I'm attracted to danger, but need you to learn how to care without completely controlling. We're going to fail at this, Reed. Probably catastrophically and repeatedly. Probably, Reed agreed. But I'd rather fail at something real with you than succeed at maintaining emotional distance that's already been destroyed. Then let's establish actual rules. Sawyer pulled back enough to see Reed's face clearly. Not professional boundaries disguised as employer-employee protocol, but honest agreements about what behavior crosses into unacceptable territory. Starting with, no tracking devices, no secret security details, no eliminating people who show interest in me. If you feel threatened, you tell me directly instead of trying to control the situation without my knowledge. And if I can't follow those rules, if the fear overrides rational judgment, Reed's question was genuine, recognizing his own limitations. Then we fight. I push back. You explain what's driving the behavior, and we figure out compromises that let you feel secure without me feeling owned. Sawyer's voice carried certainty. But Reed, I'm not leaving. Not because you've trapped me or because I can't see alternatives, but because I genuinely want to be here, with you, navigating your catastrophic control issues while you learn to trust that I'm staying by choice. Reed kissed her again, gentler this time, tasting like relief and remaining terror in equal measure. Stay tonight, and tomorrow night, and the next, not because I'm demanding it or manufacturing reasons, but because you choose to. I'll even give you a key and alarm code so you can come and go without asking permission. That's going to terrify you, Sawyer observed with slight smile, giving me independent access to your space. Absolutely. But apparently learning to be with you means sitting with constant terror that you'll realize this was a mistake and leave. Reed's smile was self-deprecating. Welcome to dating someone with abandonment issues disguised as control needs. It's going to be a complete disaster. I'm counting on it, Sawyer said, and meant it completely. They stood there in the midnight quiet of Reed's penthouse, two people who'd just chosen the messiest possible path forward but were somehow certain it was right. The walls Reed had spent a decade building weren't demolished. They'd just developed a door that only Sawyer could open, and that terrified him more than any rival or threat he'd faced in his brutal climb to power. But watching Sawyer smile at him, choosing him despite every reason to run, Reed thought maybe vulnerability was survivable after all, as long as she kept choosing to stay. The ultimatum came on Sunday evening, delivered not with anger but with devastating calm that suggested Reed had spent days calculating this exact conversation. Sawyer was reading in the living room when Reed appeared from his office, His expression carrying the controlled intensity she'd learned meant he was about to say something that would fundamentally shift their dynamic. "We need to talk," Reed said, settling onto the sofa beside her with deliberate distance. "About what happens next. About whether this," he gestured between them, "actually becomes something real, or whether we're both pretending that half measures and careful compromises will somehow be enough." But the real question was, who planned it? Sawyer set down her book, tension coiling in her stomach. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I can't do this anymore. Can't navigate the space between employer, employee, and something more. Can't maintain professional boundaries that are already shattered. Can't pretend I'm capable of casual relationship when everything about how I feel about you is absolute and consuming." Reed's voice was steady, despite the weight of what he was saying. "So I'm giving you a choice. Real choice, without coercion or manipulation or manufactured dependency." Sawyer went very still. "What choice?" "Stay with me. Fully, completely. No more maintaining separate apartment or pretending you work here rather than live here. Move into this penthouse not as my housekeeper but as my partner. Someone who exists in my world by choice rather than employment contract. Except that being with me means security protocols and territorial possessiveness and constant awareness that rivals might use you as leverage. Choose this dangerous, complicated life with absolute clarity about what you're choosing." Reed paused, his jaw tightening before he continued. "Or leave, completely. I'll terminate your employment with 6 months severance and glowing recommendations that ensure you find stable work elsewhere. I'll make sure Flynn James or someone like him has opportunity to offer you the normal life I can't. And I'll never contact you again. Never interfere with your choices. Never let my possessive instincts compromise your chance at ordinary happiness." This single decision gave him the upper hand again. The silence that followed was absolute. Sawyer stared at Reed, her heart hammering against her ribs as she processed the ultimatum he'd just delivered with surgical precision. "You're seriously asking me to choose between all or nothing? Between complete integration into your dangerous world or permanent separation?" "Yes," Reed's voice carried no apology. "Because anything between those extremes will destroy both of us. Half measures mean I'm constantly fighting territorial instincts while you're constantly defending boundaries. We'll hurt each other repeatedly until one of us breaks completely. So I'm forcing clarity, choose me entirely, or choose freedom from me entirely. But understand that partial commitment isn't survivable for either of us." Sawyer stood abruptly, pacing to the windows where Reed had stood during his own vulnerability confession. "That's not fair. You're essentially demanding I surrender my independence or lose you completely. How is that real choice versus coercion disguised as honesty?" "It's not fair," Reed agreed. "But it's honest. I can't be with you casually. Can't maintain appropriate boundaries. Can't watch you maintain a life outside my territory without losing my mind. And forcing me to try means I'll eventually do something catastrophic like embed tracking devices, or eliminate perceived threats or trap you through escalating control that you'll rightfully leave over. So I'm giving you the choice now, before I cross lines that make the choice impossible." Sawyer turned to face him, anger and something else, respect, maybe warring in her expression. "What about what I want? What if I want to be with you but maintain some independence? What if I'm not ready for complete integration into your world, but I'm also not ready to walk away entirely? Then you choose freedom." Reed's voice was gentle but absolute. "Because what you're describing, partial integration, maintained independence, gradual building of relationship, that's normal relationship progression that normal people navigate. But I'm not normal people, Sawyer. I'm someone whose job requires absolute control over territory and who's spent decades ensuring no one matters enough to compromise that control. And I've discovered I'm incapable of half measures when it comes to you." He thought it was over until he noticed something strange. "So you're taking the choice away by making the middle ground impossible?" Sawyer's accusation carried hurt beneath the anger. "No. I'm being honest that the middle ground doesn't actually exist despite both of us wanting to believe it does." Reed stood, moving closer but not touching. "I could pretend I'm capable of casual relationship while secretly trying to control every aspect of your life. Or I could be honest that I want absolute commitment or complete separation, with no illusions about what either choice means. I'm choosing honesty." Sawyer felt tears threaten not from sadness but from the overwhelming weight of being forced to make a decision that felt impossible despite being completely clear. What if I choose you and then realize I can't handle it? What if the security protocols and territorial possessiveness and constant danger become too much and I need out? Then you leave. Reed's voice carried devastating simplicity. "The door isn't locked, Sawyer. Choosing me doesn't mean I own you forever, or that you're trapped if circumstances change. It just means you're choosing with full knowledge of what you're choosing, rather than being gradually trapped through erosion of boundaries you thought existed. And if I choose freedom? If I decide the risk is too great or I'm not ready for this level of commitment? Sawyer forced herself to ask, despite knowing the answer would hurt. Then I let you go. Completely. No interference, no manipulation, no using my resources to monitor your life from distance. You get to build normal happiness without me haunting the margins. Reed's expression suggested this outcome would destroy him, but he'd accept it anyway. But Sawyer, I need you to actually choose, not defer the decision, not ask for more time to figure things out, not try to maintain the comfortable uncertainty we've been navigating, because that uncertainty is killing both of us in different ways. Sawyer moved to where Reed stood, her hands finding his chest where she could feel his heart racing despite his controlled exterior. You're asking me to choose between safety and danger, between ordinary happiness and extraordinary risk, between normal life and completely restructuring my existence around yours. That's terrifying, Reed. I know. Reed's hands covered hers, pressing them harder against his chest. And I hate that I'm forcing this choice instead of letting relationship develop naturally. But I also know that trying to do this gradually means I'll eventually cross lines that make you leave anyway. So I'd rather you choose with full information now than discover 6 months from now that I've become someone you can't stay with. What do you want me to choose? Sawyer asked quietly. I want you to choose me. I want you to move into this penthouse and accept security protocols and let me integrate you into every aspect of my world. I want to wake up knowing you're here by choice, not employment or manufactured dependency. Reed's voice roughened. I want you to be mine in ways that are probably toxic and definitely possessive, but feel absolutely necessary to my continued functioning. And if I need time? If I'm not ready to make this choice right now? Sawyer's question was genuine, testing whether Reed's ultimatum had any flexibility. Then you're choosing freedom by default, because asking for time means you're not certain, and uncertainty in my world gets people killed. I need to know if I'm protecting someone who's committed to being here, or if I'm trying to trap someone who's looking for exits. Reed pulled back slightly, creating physical distance that emphasized the emotional distance his ultimatum demanded. So I'm asking you to decide tonight. Stay and commit fully, or leave and build the normal life. But understand that whatever you choose, I'll respect it completely. Sawyer closed her eyes, her mind racing through calculations that felt impossible despite being completely clear. Choosing Reed meant accepting danger, control, possessiveness, constant security protocols, and the loss of independence she'd fought her entire life to maintain. Choosing freedom meant losing the intensity, the feeling of being seen, the electric connection that made ordinary happiness feel like settling for less. When she opened her eyes, Reed was watching her with an expression that mixed desperate hope and devastating acceptance, prepared for either outcome despite clearly wanting one more than the other. I choose you, Sawyer said, the words emerging with certainty that surprised her. Not because I'm trapped or because I don't see alternatives, but because I'd rather navigate your possessive intensity than perform normalcy with someone else. But Reed, this choice comes with conditions. I'll integrate into your world and accept security protocols, but you respect that I'm choosing to be here rather than being owned. I'll commit fully, but you remember that my commitment is gift rather than obligation, and we keep communicating about boundaries, even as we navigate life without the protective distance of employer-employee framework. Reed pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with desperate intensity. Done. All of it, accepted completely. You're here by choice, and I'll remind myself of that every time my control instincts override rational judgment, which will be frequently, probably catastrophically so. I'm counting on it, Sawyer said, echoing her earlier words. She pulled back enough to see Reed's face. But one more thing tomorrow, we tell people. Your associates, whoever needs to know. No more pretending I'm just your housekeeper, or that this is anything other than what it is. If I'm choosing to be in your world fully, then we're honest about what that means. Reed's jaw tightened, announcing their relationship meant making Sawyer visible as vulnerability, exposing her to rivals as leverage point, painting target that couldn't be erased if circumstances changed. But he demanded honesty and commitment. Accepting the consequences was non-negotiable. Tomorrow, Reed agreed. We tell everyone. And Sawyer, thank you for choosing danger over safety, intensity over normalcy, and me over every rational reason to run. I'll try to deserve that choice. You won't, Sawyer said with brutal honesty. Not always, probably not even most of the time, but I chose you anyway, so we'll figure it out together. They stood there in the Sunday evening quiet, Two people who just made the most irrational, dangerous, absolutely certain choice of their lives. The ultimatum had forced clarity that half measures would have avoided indefinitely. And while the path forward was terrifying and guaranteed to be complicated, at least now they were walking it with honesty rather than comfortable illusions. Sawyer had chosen Reed Stone's dangerous world completely, and Reed had chosen to let her in despite every instinct screaming that vulnerability was fatal. Tomorrow would bring complications, consequences, and the reality of integrating civilian into criminal empire. But tonight, they just held each other in the penthouse that was now their shared territory, certain only that whatever came next, they'd chosen to face it together. The transformation happened gradually over 3 weeks, though gradual was generous description for the way Reed dismantled every barrier between employer-employee and something far more integrated. Sawyer moved her belongings into the penthouse's primary suite, not the guest room where she'd stayed during the storm, but Reed's private space that no one else had ever occupied. Her clothes hung beside his custom suits. Her books appeared on his nightstand. Her presence saturated every corner of territory he'd maintained with obsessive control for a decade. The announcement to Reed's inner circle had been characteristically blunt. Sawyer is no longer employed as household staff. She's with me. Anyone who treats her as subordinate rather than partner will have very short career. The message was received with varying degrees of shock, concern, and carefully hidden amusement. Marcus had simply nodded, as though he'd been waiting for Reed to acknowledge what had been obvious for weeks. The associates had adjusted their behavior immediately, self-preservation overriding any questions about how Reed Stone's maid had become his declared partner. What followed next was completely unexpected. What surprised Sawyer most wasn't the external changes, the security protocols, the strategic briefings she was now included in, the way Reed's world opened to accommodate her presence, but the internal ones. Reed was learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to share territory without needing to control every variable. He still tracked her location compulsively, still positioned himself between her and potential threats, still struggled with the impulse to eliminate anyone who showed interest. But he was trying, visibly and honestly, to translate territorial instinct into protective partnership rather than possessive ownership. "You're staring at me again," Sawyer observed one evening, looking up from her book to find Reed watching her from across the living room, with that intense focus she'd learned meant he was processing something complicated. "I'm trying to figure out when this started feeling normal," Reed admitted, moving to sit beside her. "Having you here, seeing your things mixed with mine, waking up knowing you chose to stay. 3 weeks ago this felt impossible. Now it feels like you've always been here." Sawyer set down her book, turning to face him fully. "Does it bother you? How quickly we went from employer-employee to this?" "Terrifies me," Reed said with characteristic honesty, "because everything that matters to me eventually gets weaponized by rivals, and you matter more than anything else in my carefully constructed empire. So yes, I'm terrified. But I'm also—" He paused, searching for words to describe feeling he'd spent decades avoiding. "Content. Like I found something I didn't know I was looking for." "That's almost romantic," Sawyer teased gently. "If you ignore the part about rivals weaponizing me and your empire being built on morally questionable foundations. I'm not good at romance. I'm good at strategy and control and eliminating threats." Reed pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with familiar possessiveness that somehow felt more protective than restrictive now. "But I'm learning. Slowly, catastrophically, with your patient guidance despite my repeated failures." Sawyer laughed against his chest. "You haven't failed catastrophically yet, just moderately, which is significant improvement. Give it time. I'm sure I'll do something spectacularly inappropriate that requires major damage control." Reed's dark humor was self-aware enough to be charming, like installing security cameras in your phone or conducting background checks on your friends or, "If you finish that sentence with anything involving tracking devices, I'm moving back to my apartment for a week," Sawyer interrupted, her tone carrying enough serious warning that Reed stopped mid-thought. "No tracking devices," Reed confirmed quickly. "That's on the forbidden list, along with eliminating people you're friendly with and trying to control your movements through manufactured crises." "Good memory." Sawyer tilted her head up to kiss him. "See, you're learning, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely learning how to be with someone without needing to own every aspect of their existence. It helps that you push back," Reed admitted. "Most people in my world either fear me too much to challenge my behavior or enable it because challenging powerful men is dangerous. But you," his expression, softened into something almost vulnerable. "You don't let me get away with anything. force me to examine my instincts and differentiate between genuine security concerns and irrational control needs. Someone has to keep you honest, Sawyer said with slight smile. Otherwise you'd have me embedded with tracking devices and 24-hour surveillance while insisting it was all for my own protection. The thought has crossed my mind, Reed confessed with dark humor. But then I remember you'd leave the moment you discovered it, and the fear of losing you overrides the compulsion to control you. Most of the time. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the kind of easy coexistence that shouldn't have been possible between Mafia Boss and former housekeeper but somehow worked despite every reason it shouldn't. Finally, Sawyer spoke, her voice carrying curiosity about something she'd been wanting to ask. Why did you really lose your mind that night? When you saw me with Flynn, why did it shatter your control so completely? Reed was quiet for a long moment, his arms tightening fractionally around her as he considered how to articulate something he'd barely understood himself. Because for 8 months, you were invisible to me by design. I kept you compartmentalized as function rather than person, because acknowledging you existed beyond your role would have complicated things. And then I saw you actually saw you, not as my housekeeper but as woman who was beautiful and free and choosing someone else. And the realization that I'd been deliberately not seeing you for months while you were right there, existing in my space, being extraordinary in ways I'd refused to acknowledge. He stopped, his voice roughening. It broke something, made me confront that I'd let someone become essential while pretending they were invisible. And the idea of you building a life with someone else, of all that vitality and strength and genuine warmth going to a man who hadn't been too blind to notice you, I couldn't tolerate it. Sawyer absorbed this quietly, understanding dawning. So, she works for me, wasn't just possessive claim. It was you finally acknowledging I existed as person, rather than function. Exactly. The most inappropriate, public, catastrophic acknowledgement possible. But yes, Reed's smile was self-deprecating. I'm told healthy people notice when they're developing feelings for someone and address it through mature communication rather than explosive jealousy at public restaurants. But I've never been accused of healthy emotional processing. No, Sawyer agreed with affection. You've been accused of many things, but healthy emotional processing isn't one of them. Good thing I find your catastrophic approach to relationships more interesting than maturity would be. Lucky me, Reed said, meaning it completely. He pulled Sawyer closer, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, grounding himself in the physical reality that she'd chosen to stay despite every rational reason to run. Thank you for choosing this, for pushing back when I cross lines, for being patient while I learn how to care about someone without trying to control every variable of their safety and happiness. You're welcome, Sawyer said simply. But Reed, I need you to understand something. I didn't choose you despite your possessive intensity. I chose you partially because of it, because it means I matter enough for you to be irrational about me, because it means I've finally found someone who sees me as something worth keeping rather than something convenient to have around. So stop apologizing for your worst instincts and start owning them as a complicated part of why this actually works. Reed looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise and something that might have been relief. You're saying my catastrophic control issues are feature rather than bug? I'm saying they're complicated feature that requires constant management to prevent them from becoming toxic. But yes, the intensity you bring to caring about me is part of why I chose you over normalcy. Sawyer's voice carried certainty. Flynn James would have been kind and stable and completely unmemorable. You're possessive and dangerous and absolutely unforgettable. I'll take unforgettable over unmemorable any day. Reed kissed her with desperate gratitude, tasting like relief and remaining terror in equal measure. Because Sawyer was right, his possessive intensity was what had made her choose him, was what kept their connection electric rather than comfortable. But it was also what made him constantly terrified of crossing lines that would make her leave. The balance between those extremes was what they'd spend years navigating. But watching Sawyer smile at him, choosing him again in this moment just as she'd chosen him during the ultimatum, Reed thought maybe constant terror of losing something precious was acceptable price for actually having something worth keeping. They stayed intertwined on the sofa as evening deepened into night, two people who'd found each other through completely inappropriate circumstances but were somehow making it work anyway. The penthouse that had been Reed's solitary territory was now their shared home. The woman who'd been invisible housekeeper was now essential partner. And the man who'd built empire on emotional distance was learning to be vulnerable with someone he'd accidentally let matter. It wasn't healthy relationship by any conventional standard, but it was honest, chosen, and absolutely right for the complicated people they actually were. And sometimes, That was enough. Morning light filtered through the penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows, catching on the coffee mugs and scattered reports that marked their Sunday routine. Reed reviewing security briefings while Sawyer read beside him. Comfortable silence, broken only by occasional comments about particularly interesting updates. 6 weeks had passed since the ultimatum that forced clarity. 6 weeks of learning to navigate partnership that still carried complications but felt increasingly natural rather than forced. Sawyer set down her book. Studying Reed with the perceptive focus he'd learned meant she was about to ask something she'd been thinking about for a while. "Can I ask you something? About that night at the restaurant, when you lost your mind?" Reed looked up from his reports, giving her his full attention. "Of course. Why, she works for me. Of all the things you could have said, why choose the one phrase that made it sound like you were claiming ownership rather than—" Sawyer paused, searching for words. "Rather than admitting you cared about me?" Reed set aside his work, recognizing this conversation required more than divided attention. "Because in that moment, employment was my only legitimate claim to you. I couldn't say she's mine because you weren't. Couldn't say I care about her because I'd spent 8 months deliberately not acknowledging that truth. So I defaulted to the one thing I could justify professional authority over your time and attention." He smiled slightly, self-deprecation evident. It was supposed to sound like employer protecting territorial interests. Instead, it sounded like possessive bastard making inappropriate claim over subordinate. "It was both," Sawyer said with gentle honesty. "Employer protecting territory and possessive bastard finally admitting I mattered. That's what made it so devastating you were being honest about wanting to control me while disguising it as professional concern." "I was terrified," Reed admitted. "Watching you with Flynn, seeing you happy and free and choosing someone else, it forced me to confront that I'd let you become essential while pretending you were invisible. And the terror of losing something I hadn't even acknowledged wanting made me do the most public, inappropriate, catastrophic thing possible." Sawyer moved closer, her hand finding Reed's. "What were you actually feeling in that moment? Not the rational employer concern you tried to project, but what you were really experiencing." Reed closed his eyes, remembering the restaurant with visceral clarity, the sight of Sawyer laughing, Flynn's hand on her arm, the blinding jealousy that had shattered decades of controlled emotional distance. Like I was watching someone steal something precious I didn't know I had. Like you were mine in ways I had no right to claim but couldn't deny feeling. Like if I didn't act immediately, I'd lose my chance to." He opened his eyes, meeting Sawyer's gaze directly. "To keep you. Not as my housekeeper but as the person who made my carefully controlled world feel like actual home, rather than strategic territory." "So when you said she works for me, what you meant was—" Sawyer prompted gently. "What I meant was, she belongs in my world, with me, not building a normal life with someone who can offer her safety I can't provide." Reed's voice was rough with honesty. "I was claiming you territorially, possessively, inappropriately, but I was also finally admitting you mattered enough to be irrational about, that your happiness affected me in ways I couldn't control or calculate away." Sawyer absorbed this quietly, her thumb tracing patterns on Reed's hand. "I need to tell you something too, about why I chose you despite every rational reason to pursue normalcy with Flynn." "Tell me," Reed said, genuine curiosity evident. "I spent my entire life being invisible. Foster care, service jobs, relationships with men who saw me as convenient, rather than essential. I learned to exist quietly, to not demand attention, to be grateful for basic kindness, rather than expecting to be seen as someone worth keeping. And then," Sawyer's voice gained intensity, "then I watched you lose your mind seeing me with someone else. Watched you violate every professional boundary and public protocol just to intervene in my date. Watched you be completely irrational about me despite having spent 8 months deliberately not seeing me. And I realized for the first time in my life, someone cared enough to be catastrophic about me. Not convenient, not comfortable, but absolutely catastrophic." Reed pulled her close, understanding dawning about why his worst moment had been her turning point. "You chose me because I lost control, because the inappropriate possessiveness meant you finally mattered enough for someone to be irrational about you." "Exactly," Sawyer confirmed against his chest. "Flynn James offered safety and stability and normal happiness. You offered intensity and danger and the certainty that I was worth losing your mind over, and I'd spent enough of my life being convenient that I was ready to be catastrophic instead." Reed tilted her face up, his expression carrying devastating tenderness. "You're not catastrophic. You're essential. There's a difference. To you, maybe. To the rest of your world, I'm the housekeeper who somehow became the Mafia Boss's declared partner through unclear circumstances that definitely violated appropriate boundaries. Sawyer's smile was slight. Pretty sure that qualifies as catastrophic by any conventional standard. Then I'm grateful for catastrophic rather than conventional. Reed kissed her with gentle intensity. Because conventional would have meant you building normal life with Flynn James, while I continued pretending you were invisible function, rather than person I'd accidentally let matter. And that would have been the real catastrophe, losing you without ever admitting I wanted to keep you. They sat in comfortable silence, 6 weeks of navigation behind them, and lifetime of complications ahead. But the foundation was solid now. Honesty about possessive intensity, boundaries that were communicated rather than assumed, partnership that acknowledged both Reed's control needs and Sawyer's requirement for autonomy. It wasn't conventional relationship structure, but it was working for the complicated people they actually were. Can I tell you something else? Sawyer asked quietly. About what I see when I look at you now versus what I saw 8 months ago? Please. 8 months ago, I saw a powerful man who controlled everything in his territory with absolute authority. Impressive, terrifying, completely impenetrable. Now, Sawyer's voice softened. Now I see someone who's brave enough to be vulnerable despite every instinct screaming that vulnerability is fatal. Someone who's learning to share control despite decades of survival depending on maintaining it. Someone who's chosen to let me in despite reasonable certainty that caring about me makes him weaker in a world that exploits weakness. Reed felt something tighten in his chest, gratitude and terror in equal measure. You realize that makes me more dangerous, not less? Now that you matter, I'll do catastrophic things to protect you. Things that cross lines I've carefully maintained for strategic reasons. Rivals will notice, will test whether you're leverage they can exploit, and I'll respond with disproportionate violence because the thought of anyone using you against me is— He couldn't finish, the words lodging in his throat. Unacceptable, Sawyer finished gently. I know, and I've chosen to stay anyway, which means I'm accepting those consequences alongside you. We'll navigate it together, your overprotective responses, rival threats, the reality that I'm now vulnerability in your carefully constructed empire. But Reed, I'd rather be your acknowledged vulnerability than someone else's convenient partner, because at least with you, I know I matter absolutely, rather than conditionally. You do, Reed confirmed with rough certainty. Matter absolutely, catastrophically, in ways that would get me killed if rivals understood the full extent of it. But I've spent decades building power specifically so I could protect things I care about. Now I finally have something worth protecting beyond abstract territory and strategic advantages. Your safe place, Sawyer said, recalling phrase Reed had used weeks ago. You said I was your safe place despite the world you operate in being anything but safe. I've been thinking about that. What it means to be safe place for someone who's built entire existence on controlled danger. It means you're the one aspect of my life that doesn't require constant threat assessment and strategic calculation, Reed explained. It means when I come home, actually home, not just a residential space you're here by choice rather than coercion or manufactured dependency. It means I can be vulnerable with you without that vulnerability being weaponized or exploited. Your safe place not because you're safe, but because you're choosing to be here despite full knowledge of who I actually am beneath the carefully constructed image. Sawyer felt tears threaten at the devastating honesty. So when you said she works for me that night, what you were really trying to protect was the possibility of home. Reed finished quietly. The possibility that invisible housekeeper I'd been deliberately not seeing for 8 months might actually be the person who could transform my carefully controlled territory into actual home rather than strategic stronghold. And I was terrified that possibility was walking away with Flynn James to build normal life I couldn't offer. I'm not walking away, Sawyer said with absolute certainty. The same certainty she'd felt during ultimatum that forced clarity. Not now, not later. Not when things get complicated or dangerous, or when your possessive intensity crosses into territory that requires serious discussion. I chose you, Reed. Chose your catastrophic approach to caring. Chose the complications and dangers. Chose being essential over being convenient. And I'll keep choosing you even when it would be easier not to. Reed held her like she was precious and breakable despite knowing she was neither. Promise me something. What? Promise that if I cross lines that make this unsustainable, you'll tell me directly, rather than quietly planning exit strategy. Promise that if my control needs become toxic rather than intense, you'll push back hard enough that I'm forced to acknowledge it. Promise. His voice roughened. Promise that you'll give me chance to correct course before deciding leaving is only option. I promise, Sawyer said, understanding the vulnerability beneath the request. I'll communicate boundaries clearly. I'll push back when you cross lines, and I'll give you opportunity to adjust behavior before making permanent decisions. But Reed, you have to promise something too. Anything. Promise that when I push back, you'll listen rather than defaulting to territorial dominance. Promise that when we fight, and we will fight, probably frequently and dramatically, you'll remember I'm pushing back because I'm choosing to stay rather than because I'm looking for exits. Promise that you'll trust my choice to be here even when your terror of losing me makes you want to bind me so tightly I can't leave. I promise, Reed said, the words carrying weight of genuine commitment. I'll listen when you push back. I'll remember fighting means you're staying rather than leaving. And I'll work on trusting your choice despite my brain constantly calculating ways you might be coerced or manipulated rather than genuinely wanting to be here. They sat together in the morning light, two people who'd found each other through completely inappropriate circumstances and were somehow making it work through honesty rather than comfortable illusions. The journey from employer-employee to essential partners have been messy, catastrophic, and absolutely right for the complicated people they were. You know what's funny? Sawyer said after several minutes of comfortable silence. If you hadn't lost your mind that night, if you'd maintained professional distance and let me build normal life with Flynn, we'd both have been miserable without realizing what we were missing. Not funny, Reed corrected. Terrifying. Because it highlights how close I came to losing you through deliberate blindness about what you actually meant to me. But you didn't lose me, Sawyer pointed out. You lost your mind instead, exploded with possessive claim in public restaurant, and inadvertently showed me I mattered enough to be irrational about. So maybe catastrophic honesty was exactly what we both needed. Maybe, Reed agreed, pulling her closer. Though I still wish my moment of clarity hadn't involved violating every professional boundary and public protocol simultaneously. Could have been more dignified. Dignity is overrated, Sawyer said with gentle humor. I'll take catastrophic honesty over dignified distance any day. They stayed intertwined on the sofa as morning deepened toward afternoon. Two people who'd chosen each other against all rational judgment and were making it work through brutal honesty about their respective complications. The penthouse that had been Reed's solitary territory was now their shared home, not because Sawyer worked there, but because she'd chosen to stay despite every reason to run. And that choice, renewed daily through small actions and honest conversations, was what transformed "she works for me" from possessive claim into accurate description of different kind. She works with me, for us, building home from catastrophic honesty and chosen vulnerability. And Reed Stone, Mafia Boss who'd spent decades avoiding emotional connection, had finally found something worth more than control. Someone who chose to stay not because they had to, but because they wanted to. That was worth every moment of terror that accompanied letting someone matter absolutely. If you felt something while reading this story, please subscribe. That's how I know these stories mean something to you. Take a second to join our community of story lovers. Your support keeps this world of emotions alive.